So we're now going to turn our attention to part 3 of the overview of CS 253 on parallel functional programming with Java Android and Spring WebFlux. In this part of the discussion, I'll talk about how to set up the Java and Android IDE on Android Studio, as well as set up GitLab that you'll be using to store your code. And then finally, we'll talk about how to access Android and Java source code if you're interested in doing that. In order to use Android, you'll need to install the latest, greatest release of Android Studio, which is at the moment Android Studio Chipmunk, which is 2021.2.1. I think it's kind of funny they name the Android API levels after suites, but they seem to be naming the Android Studio after various kinds of animals. In this case, chipmunks. They've had Arctic fox and other things in the past, or bumblebees and so on. So here are the installation steps. First, go get the latest version of Android Studio, which you can get at this link, and install it. It should take a relatively short time to install, depending on the networking speed and computer speed that you have at your disposal. Then go ahead and launch the Android Studio SDK Manager. And the way you do this is in Android Studio, there's a little screen at the top, which will give you a menu item. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. So here you can see the Android Studio project for the crawler program that you use for your assignment. If you come over here and you kind of hover over this icon towards the upper right-hand part, you'll see something that says SDK Manager. And if you click on that, it'll give you the SDK Manager. And then what you'll do is you'll just select Android API level 32 and go ahead and install it. So you'll need to have that installed in order to be able to do the programming assignments. So that's the first part. So continuing on, the next thing you'll need to do is you need to create an Android API 32 emulator. And you can read about that at the link below. I'll also show you how you can find that with Android Studio. So now we're back in Android Studio again, and you come up here, and if you click on this particular icon, if you hover your mouse or your pointing device over it, it'll say Device Manager. And this will go ahead and give you a way to create the device. I have one installed, but if I wanted to create a new one, I would click on the Create Device button, and then I could select the particular kind of form factor I want. I have Pixel 5 selected now, but you can see you can select other versions, let's say Pixel 4. And once you do that, then it'll give you the option of downloading the appropriate version. Again, you want to make sure you get version 32. So these are the things that you'd have to do in order to be able to install the emulator or the Android Virtual Device. That's what AVD stands for. So continuing on with the slides, once you've installed Android Studio and got your SDK installed properly and you've installed and created the appropriate emulator, then you probably want to check to make sure that you've got your virtualization extensions or enhancers or optimizers turned on. They're accelerators, I guess is a better word. So depending on the platform you've got, whether it be an Intel platform or an AMD platform or an Apple platform, there's probably going to be a way that you have to enable or turn on the emulator accelerator features. And you can read more about this here at the link at the bottom of the slide. If you don't enable this, your emulator will typically run pretty slow. If you do enable it, it'll be very fast. And if you look at my videos of the assignments, you'll see I have the emulator turned on, and it indeed is quite speedy. The next topic I want to talk about is how to set up GitLab. So you'll need to use GitLab so that you can do two things. Number one, you use that to make sure that your source code is safe and properly protected in case you lose your computer or it gets stolen or it crashes. You won't lose your work. So that's issue number one. And number two, that's the way myself and the graders will be able to access your program in order to be able to review it and finally to grade it. So the way you do this is shown on this slide. First thing you'll need to do is set up an SSH key. You can read the link at the bottom of the slide and click on it if you get the PDF version to see how to set up an SSH key for GitLab. Once you've got that set up, then you go to GitLab itself and create your GitLab repository. You may have one from a previous class. That's fine. You can reuse it. But what you want to do is once you've created your repo or gone back to your repo you already have, you want to basically clone your GitLab repo onto your machine. And here's what you'll do. Assuming you've created a repository called cs-253-fall-2022, you'll then go ahead and say git clone, git at gitlab.com, your GitLab ID, whatever that happens to be. And that will end up creating a folder on your computer called the working folder. So once that's been created, it'll probably be empty at the beginning. go ahead and change your directory into it, and then you can do the next steps, which are on the next slide. So what you'll do then is you'll go ahead and get the contents that are in my read-only GitHub repository. And you do that by saying git remote add skeletons, and you give my GitHub repository link. And that will go ahead and essentially provide that information to you, which you can then get the latest version of my code by doing git pull skeletons master. Master is a term that's fallen into disuse. That's the way it was done originally. You can also call it main if you prefer to use that. So git pull skeletons main, git pull skeletons master works basically the same way. Once you've done that, you should then have a copy of the folders from my GitHub repo that correspond to the assignments. And then you will do your work. You'll fill in the to-do tags and so on. And when you're done, you'll commit your changes to your local repository that Git manages by doing git commit. And then probably right thereafter, I usually do these things together, then you'll go ahead and push your changes to the GitLab repo up in the cloud at the GitLab cloud site. And the way you do that is by saying git push origin master or git push origin main. Just make sure you're consistent. And that'll then go ahead and push the code to your repository. And that way, if something goes awry, you can have a copy that you'll get back. So please get in the habit of committing and pushing frequently. And of course, you'll have to do that before I can review your code. There is an overview of these steps in item number 13 in my frequently asked questions wiki at this link at the bottom of the slide. Here's just a quick overview of how to set up your GitLab repo. In the first place, the icons may have changed a little bit. This is something from a year or so ago, but you create a project that will then prompt you to give the name of the project. You want to say CS-253-fall 2022. Please follow that to the letter. Please use those names for things. It makes our grading much easier. Then you'll click on the Create Project button down here. That will go ahead and create that particular project, and it'll give you some hints on how you can clone it. And then the next step you want to do is you want to go ahead and go to the Project Members Settings tab and add me. You can look me up as Douglas Craig Schmidt, and then make me a maintainer. So please make me a maintainer, which means I can edit and add my comments to your code. I'll also be sending out later on Piazza the GitLab IDs of the graders. So you'll have to update and add them as maintainers too, please. And then when you're all done, you'll be ready to go. So you can use your account as we showed previously in order to be able to add and modify the code based on the skeletons that I provide. The last piece of this overview, just kind of a quick summary of places you can get access to source code that might be interesting. You can get the Android source code for browsing. You can get the Android source code in its entirety. You can download it if you want. It's open source. There's also ways to browse Java code. There's ways to download various versions of Java. So I highly recommend you take a look at this code. What's particularly interesting about it is it uses lots of patterns we're going to talk about in the implementation of these different frameworks. So you'll see all kinds of concurrency and parallelism and synchronization patterns lurking in the Android and Java code. And that's really cool because it demonstrates that these patterns that you've learned about in some courses here that may seem very abstract and very academic are actually very widely used in practice in all kinds of industrial strength platforms such as Android and Java. So that's the end of part 3 of our overview of CS253.